All right then. Hello everyone out there. My name's Ben Kirchner, and we will have a chat about using R and Python within Power BI. So a bit of a niche subject, but still quite an interesting one for people who have used Power BI and they want to get a bit more flexibility in the way that they collect their data or ingest their data, and the way that they want to visualize their information. So what we're going to be talking about today, so where it can be used, so we'll have a bit of a chat about how that gets, your R or your Python script gets applied, how you would set up Power BI. We've got some examples of the ways that you can implement that and some traps as we go along the way. Bit of housekeeping, we have the Q&A option within Zoom, so please feel free to use that as you've got any questions coming up, and any natural breaks, we'll answer those as we go along. What we're also going to provide at the when you get the thank you for attending email, we're going to attach the Power BI file that we're using, or sorry, not the one we're using, but the one that's already pre-canned. That's got all the examples in there and some of the notes within this slide, so no pen or paper needed for this. It's just using your eyes and your ears for this course, or for this webinar, I should say. So make your life a bit easier as well. So just a basic introduction of what is R and what is Python. So they're both scripting languages, so very high level, not designed for hardcore developers, I should say, looking at very technical details. It's quite human readable, or tries to aim to be like that, so that it's a very shallow learning curve to get involved and start using the technologies. With Python, so that concentrates more on text analysis. That's where it came from back in the day. R focuses more on your statistical analysis, so people who've used like your MATLABs or SPSS or Mathematica and those type of things, that's where R's come from. But in most cases, more or less, they overlap with their functionality. So things like machine learning or AI, both of them are very good at doing that. Plotting, so graphs and charts, and we'll have a look at that a bit later, and interactive analysis as well. So we also talk about the installation, but both of them have IDEs, or integrated developer environments, that you can use, which makes it a lot easier than using, say, a command line. So RStudio is pretty popular in the R world. For Python, there's idle, there's Spider, there's PyCharm, and probably many more out there that also do the job as well. So applying this within Power BI, so we've just got an example graphic down here below, but the three areas that you can use a Python or an R script is the data source itself. So if anyone's been to Power BI and they've gone to that get data option and they see Excel and SQL databases and many other sources, you can also choose a Python or an R script that can run on your behalf to get information. So one example of that may be a web scraping process. That's one of the examples that we've got. So that means that there might be a website, there might be a HTML table sitting there that you want to go and pick up. You can quickly go and collect that using your Python or R to go get that information and have that as a data source within your report. You can also have as a processing step within your Power Queries. So you might have your data ingested, say, from a SQL database, and then you want to apply some Python script on top of that to go and maybe do some machine learning or some sort of cleaning activity or whatever you like to do. So you can also have that as a step within Power Query when you're altering your data sets. And then within Power BI Desktop is where you can apply a plot or a visualization, where you might have a very advanced graph that you want to show within your Power BI file. Python and R allow you to have the extra flexibility of effectively building a plot from scratch and to present that to you in a way that is more comfortable, and something that Power BI, the pre-canned visualizations or something you get on the marketplace don't do what you want it to do. And all of these things, all compatible with the Power BI web service within reason. So something like if you're doing like a Python or R script that's looking at a local file, that's obviously not going to work in the web services. That's a different machine. But as far as the visualizations are concerned and whatnot, all that works as you'd expect. So whatever experience you're receiving in Power BI Desktop when you're building your visualizations, that will then go through onto the web service as well, which makes it very easy to work with. As far as configuring Power BI, you will need to download an R and Python engine first. So we've got two web addresses there, or you can just look at Google to find those find the information out. If you're using Python, you will have to install some packages, which are also on Microsoft's website. They talk about what you need to do to set up your environment first. We've got that information in our example Power BI file. So it's not on here because the address is too long, but that will be in there, and you can click on that and go and get that information if that interests you. But it uses Pandas and matplotlib, which are two quite common libraries to use. So within Power BI options, and we'll take you through this in the example in the next slide, is going to the options and configuring what R engine or what Python engine you want to use, and what IDE you'd like to use as well. But we'll talk about that on the next slide. So our next slide is the actual demo, so the fun part of this webinar. Any questions so far? Nothing in the Q&A, so I'm going to take that as a no. But any questions, obviously, please send them through and we'll answer them as best as we can. All right then, so I'm going to go, well, first of all, have a look at the example file that you can get, and then after that, we'll go away and we'll build some of these from a blank file, and then we'll talk about some traps and whatnot and conclude the meeting. So we've got some R examples here. The data is very average. It's just being web scraped from an example website, so the data is not that crash hot, but it just illustrates to you what you can and can't do. So in each of these files, we have a Power BI visual out of the box. So we've got the mapping one, the Bing map one here, but that's using, in this case, the R data to go and produce that information. And on the right, we've then got what you can do within R. It's not an exciting plot. It's a very basic example, but as far as limitations go, your imagination is really the only limitation for that. With the Python examples, that's the same premise as well. This is some Pokemon data. I don't know anything about Pokemon, but it looked like an exciting data set, so I picked it up. And so we've just got two scatter plots there. One on the left is the one you get out of Power BI. The one on the right is just a basic one that Python can produce as well. And then we've got the notes from the slides, which covers all the details within the slides that we've gone through, and any other tidbit information there as well. So we'll start first with a blank sheet, and then we'll show you how to implement this. Now, the way that gets implemented is more or less the same for R and Python, so there's no real difference. We'll just be focusing on R today, but for Python, there's really no difference. The concepts are all there, they're all the same, so don't feel like you're missing out on anything. It's more or less the same. So what I'll do, I'll get my blank sheet up. I've already got one loaded, so nothing too exciting here. So what I'm going to do is to do the first example. So this is where we've got data that's coming from a script that we've made. So in this case, the R data contains some oil prices. So, whoops, the R data comes from just an oil prices website that we just scrape the table from, and we collect that information. So to do that, I can just go to Get Data, and I can go to More. Once that comes up, that Get Data window, so many data sources in Power BI, it takes a while to come up. Or it's the cursor doing something live, one of the two. Oh, there we go, good stuff. So if I just go to the search text box at the top and just type in script, that will give me a choice of an R script or a Python script. So for this case, we're doing R. If you were doing Python, you would choose that one. So we'll just choose R for now, and then we press connect. So the next window you'll get up is just a blank box. More or less you type in the script that you want to do. So in this case, you might be in your IDE, so it might be RStudio. You've coded all what you want to do and what the outputs are. Then you want to push, then you can just copy and paste that into this RScript window, or if you're using Python, your PyCharm or whatever, you paste that into here as well. So I've already made one up just for the sake of brevity. So just copy and paste this into here. So this script is a bit, the first part or the main part of this, I won't go through all the code, but more or less, this is just doing the web scraping, as I said, from that oil prices website. And the second part here, this loner line down here, this is just using the iris data set. People who've done data science before, this is a very common data set talking about petal widths and lengths and things like that to get some sort of clustering or grouping. Now, this data obviously doesn't relate to oil prices, but what I want to show is you can have multiple data sets within your R script, and you can publish those out as separate tables. So what we're expecting when this is run is you would get your oil prices and an iris data set both coming out. So if I go okay to that, that's how good I'll think about it. So it's actually processing the script now. So as I said, we should be getting 2 table outputs, and then we do there. So we have our prices, which is our oil prices. So I can tick that box, and then all it really is just a name and just a price, very bland. But then we've got the iris data as well, and then that gives petal lengths and sepal lengths and what the species is, more or less. So I've ticked those 2 boxes. So if anyone who's used Power BI and they've used something like SQL Server or some sort of relational database or Excel with multiple sheets, you know about, you can import multiple tables or multiple sheets at the same time when you tick the box. So that's all this is effectively doing. So we're going to load that in. That's just going to apply that. So right now, this is actually going live out to that particular website, scraping the information, and it's coming back to us in a Power BI file. This is only can be used as an import. It can't be used as direct query. So some people who have analysis server, some people who've got SQL databases that have that direct query option. So anytime you make a change in the Power BI report, it will then ask the query. This is just doing as an import. So you'd have to refresh your data set if you want to get new information to run that particular script. Okay, then. So as you can see on the right, we've got our iris data and we've got our prices data. And as we saw in the prices, there was just those 2 items there. And in the iris data, we've got all those 5 fields there as well. So that's looking at as a complete raw data set, more or less. So it's looked at the Python or the R file, it's run that, and it's just produced the results based from that. So the second thing you can also do is to have as an intermediate step within any of your data sources coming in, is that you can apply a Python script to that as well, or an R script to that as well, if you want to do some extra logic. So we'll have a look at that now. If I go to home and I go to transform data, so I've already got my data, so I'm just going to transform one of these existing ones. If that then works, I can then add some more applied steps here. So right now, all it's doing is picking up the information as it sees in that particular R script. What I can also do now is to add a step in. So if I go to transform tab up the top here, I can then see on the far right, I can run an R script or I can run a Python script. So this one will add an additional step or a set of additional steps in the applied steps down here when I'm doing my adding my script in. So I'm going to run R script. It's then going to bring up our box of information. This one's telling us that the data set holds the input data. So the incoming data is called data set. So when you're running this or testing this in your IDE, you would have to have a data set variable set up so that you can compare apples with apples. So let me go and grab my code. This is a very simple example. All we're doing is appending an additional column to the data set, just called category. And all we're saying is that within that last price column, so in the oils column, if I can move this, yes, I can. If it's greater than $20, 20, then we classify that as expensive, otherwise cheap. There's nothing really limiting you in this script. If you want to add libraries, if you want to do that, then that's also possible as well. And we'll come back to that one a bit later on, how you actually do that. But more or less, this is very simple. Just if it's greater than 20, it's expensive, otherwise it's cheap. And then I just return as categorized data from that data set. So this line is just effectively, this bit here is just adding a new column, and then I'm just returning that data set with the appended column back to this variable called categorized data. If I go OK to that, you can see now it's run that R script, and then from that we've got the categorized data from the output, and so then you can see expensive and cheap, more or less. As I said, any step that you want to add to this, it doesn't have to be a Python or an R file, can be an Excel, can be SQL, can be anything more or less. It's just that we've only got an data set here, but nothing stopping you from doing this to any other data set you've got available. And then so once that's done, then we can just go file and close and apply that. And as you can see, we've got last price and name in that prices data set. It's going to run that whole Python file and the additional step that we've added in. And you'll see then you will get a category field. So that is a bit of good news there. And so if I plot that on the map, I'll just do that quickly. Where are you? There you are. So I'll just put that on the map. Drag it down there, make it bigger. Now the locations aren't going to be too good either, but it puts the dot on the map, which is what we're really concerned about. And so now it just turns into an ordinary data set. So I can have legend, and I can have my cheap and expensive there. So you can see all the dots are there, and it looks like any old map. Anything you want to do, if I want to click on a circle, I can do that to filter things out. If I want to add a drop down, that's certainly not a problem as well. Maybe not that big, but I can have the category in there. Just shrink that up a bit. Just move it over here, and I can say, oh, where's all the cheap stuff? And they're all there. So it works exactly the same as any other data set that you come through. The only difference is that the source is not a traditional one, as an example, but it's yeah, there's nothing else different about it. So I've got a question here. So if we use Python or R for getting data and the script is reading from an online source, we'll be able to refresh the Power BI service. So that would just be a traditional refresh that you would do. So it would be like if you had an import for any of your data sources. So, you know, you can set up SQL Server to even be like an import data source. And so it would then run that script and read it and then save the results. Obviously, if that online source is down, or in our case, we're scraping a table, then there may be some problems in getting that data, but more or less it runs just like any other data source. And I mean, in Power BI has a lot of APIs anyway, they're already pre-canned, so things like Salesforce and Co, they're already set up the same way as well. So it would just run every time you do your refresh, whether it be in the desktop or whether it be a web service and you want to schedule it, that would also run on the same premise. All right then. So that's the two types. of the third part's the visualization. This is probably the more interesting part. So a lot of people have already got their data in some sort of structured format. But what one can do is that they can build some sort of graphic or some sort of plot from that data. So as I showed, we've had a basic one before. So with the iris data, so we'll add that one in here as well. So to add a visualization in from R or Python, you've got your two icons here in your visualizations. They've been there for quite some time in Power BI. So it's just a case of clicking on that. You might get asked this question. It's going to tell you that if you do some scripts, it may do things that you're unexpected, but as you're writing the code, that shouldn't be a problem. It's just a warning, just to make sure that the script isn't going to do something funky. So what the R script or the Python script wants is an input. So we can drag the fields that you want. So if you had two data sets that were related, so, and you know, we've got our prices here, but we might have other data like a better location or, you know, different categories of oil or something to that effect, then you can drag and drop those fields in like you would if you were building, say, a table or a matrix within Power BI. So for us, we will need, as I look at my cheat sheet, so right now we're going to use the iris data as an example because that gives a much better plot than the other data that we have. So in this case, I can drag through the petal length, drop that there, the petal width, and the species. And so we just want to scatter plot with the length on the x-axis and width on the y-axis. And then the different colored dots would be the type of species that's available. So now that I've done that, this bottom bit down below has now enabled itself. And effectively, it's running the stuff that's commented out on line 3 and 4. It's going to do that for you already. So it's going to bring back a unique data set. Now, in some cases, we'll have to check to see if there's any summarization, because normally in Power BI, it defaults to some sort of aggregation, respect to our charts or whatever. Tables aren't that popular. So just be careful with that, that you will have to change this to don't summarize, because you want all the data coming back. You don't want a summarized part, otherwise you just have 3 lines. So the sum of all the length, the sum of all the widths on a per species basis. So that's not too interesting for us. And that's already don't summarize because that's a categorized field. So right now that data set's no longer 3 lines, it's now, or 3 rows, it's now significantly more. So now the code that we paste in here, so I go and pick that up. So right now this first line, or line 7, what you can see there is that we're installing a particular package. We'll come back to that. That's a bit more of an advanced topic. But sometimes you need to have libraries installed to do some more interesting things. So this case is ggplot2, which is a very popular plotting within R. So we have to install that. Then our line 8 is actually building the plot. So we're introducing the data, is the data set, so what's coming in. AES, which I think stands for aesthetic. So the x-axis is the length and the y-axis is width, because it's x and y. And then our points is the color of species. So just breaking it down the color by species. Some options I have, I can run this particular script. I have script options, which I'm assuming just goes back to the options settings. Oh yes, we go there. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, that's the arrow I'm looking for. Or you have this external option. So the arrow pointing to a northeast direction. That's going to open up the IDE that you had set up in your options, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So that for me would open up RStudio, and I get that content. So I can still I can still run this in my IDE to see what my results look like, rather than coming in here and changing things and trying to correct errors and whatnot. So what that will do, I might give it a try. What it will do is that obviously that data set's internal. It's actually making a CSV file for you in the background within your RStudio session. Excuse me. And now it's bringing up everything else. And that's the previous one. Oh, I don't know what happened there. But usually what would happen, it will bring up this particular data set as a CSV file that would import in for you. So that would treat it exactly the same way that you would in the IDE, would also happen here as well. So if I press the play button, that's going to run that particular script, and it will then drop that in there like that. From what we saw before in the examples. As far as if you want to have some sort of filter, that's certainly no problem as well. So let me click out of that. If I drag species on and change that to be a filter, move that up a bit so I can see what's going on. I can choose, same as before with the plots, I can choose 2 different species. I can do whatever I want. Every time I'm clicking on something, it's going to refresh. It would be the same, and this is probably not a good example because they're 2 distinct data sets with no relationship. But if I was in this particular graph, and let's say this was some sort of species, if I was click on that, or a range of data points or whatever, it would also then go and refresh this plot as well. So your plots are very similar to also how Power BI visualization works as well. The only downside to a visualization is that it's not interactive. So if I go to a dot and I click on the dot, I get a tooltip. If I click on the dot, it will then filter those results out for me and all the, the interesting things, the interactivity of Power BI. With your plots, and that's R in Python as well, these are just images. So no matter how much I click or do or whatever, nothing's happening. It's just a raw image, more or less, that gets updated when you trigger a change as a filter or whatever the case may be. So that's just one thing to be a little bit wary of. But people say there's a bit of a downside, but to me, I don't find it too much of a problem, because if I'm using an R plot or a Python plot, it's going to be a very complicated piece of information I want to send out. So it could be multiple charts or tables within this particular example, or it could be like multiple axes going across. So I might have a 2 y-axis or something to that effect, or a grid of charts or something like that. So it's seen as a limitation, but really your R and Python plot should be designed for very advanced data sets that you want to tell a story about, not for really interactivity, if that makes sense. Because all the basic ones are covered within either the ones that you get out of the can when you use Power BI, or in the marketplace that you can go and download some additional visualizations as well. So yeah, I'd be, if it's something that you can't do in the marketplace, or you can't do from the canned versions of the visualizations that come with Power BI, more than likely you're going to have more data or more theories on there to make it complicated. So clicking on something would make it a bit confusing or a bit difficult to use. But more or less, they're the three types. So we talked about the original getting as a data source. We've talked about it as a step within any of your Power BI data sets that you're using. And we've talked about it using as a visualization. So what I'll talk about now is the options for setting it up. So within your Power BI, if you go to File, and if you go to Options and Settings and go to Options itself, on the left side, you'll see Python scripting and R scripting over here. And so both of these more or less have the same settings. So the first question that gets asked is your R setting, or where your R engineers or where your Python engineers. It will try its best to detect them, and I've got 2 of them installed. So some people do have multiple. So something like Python, where there's Python version 2 and Python version 3, it's not unusual to see multiple versions there. So I just come with the default one there. If you've got an IDE set up, that will also appear in this list as well. So I already have RStudio installed. That's why I can see that there. There's also some links you can go, how do I install R? That will also help you if you're getting a bit stuck, and also some IDEs as well. Python scripting is effectively the same option. So I've got 2 Python environments, and I've also got different, well, only one IDE, but there's actually another one installed on here, but they'll also appear on here as well. And so that IDE is useful where we're looking at the plot, where we can go out, we can play with that data or come back in, or if you're doing the first 2 options, like a true data source or as a step, you can use those and copy and paste your code going between them. As far as limitations on your scripts, I've run 200-lined R scripts in here, and it doesn't seem to have a problem. It doesn't seem to be any form of limitation. They haven't been large data sets given that. Obviously with R and Python, it's using your local resources to do a job. So something that might, like a CSV file that's a couple of gigabytes in size, that may be a problem. You might just run out of memory on your machine. And the web service, I wouldn't think they give you a large amount of memory to go and process large data sets. So that's something just to be a bit wary of. But as far as calculations and whatnot's concerned, I haven't seen much of a performance difference using it on my laptop versus the web service. So something that's computationally difficult, like a machine learning algorithm, that hasn't been too difficult. So I think really memory would be your only main concern, because if you've got a good machine, you'll have 8 gigs or 16 gigs of RAM on your machine. When it goes to the web service, you probably won't be given that much. So that's something just to be a bit wary of. But I think we've all copped that anyway, when even with like a traditional data source, you're not doing any calculations that the web service, if you want to say a pro or a free version, that you do hit that limitation just with processing the data on the web service as well. So that was one thing. The other thing I was talking about is importing libraries. So what I might do, I might go back to my transform data and we'll have a look at that, that example as well. The first one that we had a look at. So if I go to source and I press this little cog here, I can go and edit my script like you would with any of the other data sources. As I go up the top here, I can see that I've got this particular library, one of the libraries there. So why we do this is that when on your desktop, you can go to R and you can install, or Python, you can install your own libraries without any problems. The issue is that when it goes to the web service, that's not available because you don't have access to the Power BI web service. And in regards to installing packages or seeing files, it's a black box more or less. You upload your report and you hope that it works on the other side more or less. So what this is going to do is that it looks to see if the package is already installed or not. If it's not, then it goes away and it downloads that again, or downloads it again from the repository, and it will then apply that for you. And also Python's the same as well. So if you have, in Python, you might have a particular library, it would follow the same principle. Checks to see if it's there. If there's a failure that the library is not available, then there's some code to go away and figure out what the package is missing and download that and apply that, and then imports that in. And for a lot of people, they will be using libraries just for plotting, as an example. Out of the box, for something like R, it's ggplot2 is not available, and that's a common one that people use. So they'll be certainly using that. With Python, you get matplotlib already installed before you use it, so that one is a little bit better. But people want to do interesting things like machine learning or scraping websites like we're doing. Those things don't come out of the box. So that's where we have these particular libraries there, and you have to add that line in for each time that you want to do it. All right then. Any questions on the Power BI side of things? No? That's all right. So let's go back to our slide deck. Here we are. So we've done all that. So traps, so we've talked about this one already about using the particular library to add that in. So just be careful when you run something that if you do have to include a library, you have to do it that way. Check to see if it's there. If it's not, go and install it, and then you should be fine after that. So any objects that you're returning to Power BI as a data source or a step within Power Query, so our first two examples that we have, they must return as a data frame. So these are very common data types within R and in Python. So you can't just return a block of text and expect Power BI to figure out what that means. A data frame will ensure, and effectively data frame is a table, more or less. So to have that data frame set up with the columns and all your data set up there necessarily, that will make that, you can then access that as we saw before. Objects returned to Power BI as a visual plot. So that last step we did when we saw the scatter plot, they have to be returned as a plot. So if you use something like ggplot or matplotlib in Python to run those, that will just return back. That'll be the first object that it sees. I believe it has to be the first object that you return is the one that you will see, but I could be wrong about that. But only one plot can be returned. So if you want to have two graphs showing in the one visual, then you'll have to do that within ggplot2 or matplotlib itself. It's got options to have multiple charts within the one plot. So that's just a step to be a bit careful of. So some questions. So Ismail, it doesn't have to be matplotlib. No, it can be anything so long as it returns as like an image is more or less the answer there. So when you run your Python file and it returns a graphic, then that will also be fine for Power BI as well. So whatever plotting library you want to use, then that's certainly fine. No, thank you for your question. What's the next slide? I think that's about it. That's about it. So we just, any other questions that people have got? Any comments that people have? More than happy to answer those. But just while people are thinking about it, so as I said at the beginning, we will hand out the examples that we got to the first Power BI window that I showed you. So that's got the scripts that we've run. It's got the plots and everything like that as well. So that's, I think that it's a good example. It shows you all three of those. We've walked through the R ones. The Python ones are very similar. So you haven't missed out on anything. It's still the same script, copying them in. It's just, instead of choosing R, you're just choosing Python, more or less. So nothing really special about that. We haven't published this report, but we've made it in a way so that it's safe. So when you publish it, you are not going to get stuck with errors or anything like, well, you shouldn't get stuck with errors and things like that. So that should be fine. Thanks. Just got a question here. Thanks for taking us through this. When using R in the transform data section, the script will have to specifically act on a column, right? Can't do an omit NA across the whole data set. It's a very good question. I think, yes, I think your theory is correct. The script would have to act on a column. You can't do an omit. I mean, yes, I think you're right in that sense. It's a bit of a technical question, but yes, I do agree. They have to act on a column. Yeah, you could filter out the data load stage as well. So if you can do your data prep there and then in your visual, I mean, even in your visual, you could do that as well. So wherever your script is, whatever, if it's a data source, if it's a plot or as a step, you can do your data cleansing within either any of those steps if you want to. There's no problem with that. It's just treated as all it's really asking is that you have an input for the last two, obviously with the step and with the visualization, and then it's just publishing out something. So within that middle part, the processing part, you can do whatever you want to enrich your data or to fix it or whatever the case may be. And I would say for the data source path, you will be doing that. So when you look at the R example, where we look at the table, we're doing a lot of cleansing to try and get that data cleaned up so it's actually usable. So that's not a surprise. Would you mind sending a Python-based copy of the queries due to the syntax change from R? Yes, that's also in that example file. So we've just been looking at R, but in that example file, the Python files are doing a web scraping example, it's adding a step, and it's also doing a plot as well. So the data is different, but the concept is still the same. Okay, any other questions? Nothing else is coming through, so sometimes the logic for R and or Python can be very complicated. Yes, I agree with you. Do you suggest we move the script off from Power BI and use Power BI to consume the results only? I suppose that's a very interesting question because it's, the complexity within your script is it may be a business rule or it may be just the way to get something set up, like your data, to do like the data cleansing part of it. I suppose your options are, if you were to use like R or Python as a data source, is you would have to think about the only other option is to say, well, I'm going to give it to a developer and they're going to, push it into that, like the data warehouse or something like that. So it's a difficult question. Well, it's a difficult answer because for me, well, personally for me as a developer, I'd like to see someone build something in R or Python and say, this is the data it's coming from, this is what we're doing, and this is how we get it out. Now, as far as when I push that into a data warehouse to make it productionized or make it cleaner or whatever the case may be, I've got my test data there, so I know what I'm trying to aim at to deliver something, and also that I can see the logic, I can read and understand what someone's trying to do, or if we can do it something better, then I can talk to the person who wrote that R or Python script. The other issues with this R and Python script is that because it lives within this particular report file, if you want to use it in another Power BI report, you're going to have to copy and paste it. So obviously when you go to a data warehouse world, that's obviously not a problem because everything's just being churned through the same machine. So to move the script off from Power BI and use Power BI to consume the results only, I'd say data warehouse. I think with Python and those type of things, there isn't really like an API system. Well, there is, but it's a bit complicated, a bit clunky, in my opinion. So if you had the script and it was on a server somewhere, and then you just wanted to use the Power BI, I forget the name, the HTML call, or to call an API to get that data and return it back as like a JSON or an XML file or something like that, then you're more than happy to. But I suppose it depends on the appetite of who's doing this. If it's just a couple of people in a department and they just use this to get some interesting results, then that's great. But yeah, if it's got to be something that the enterprise is going to use, well, then the data warehouse or some sort of blending in between. So it's an interesting question. And I think it's just really the case is that, and with Power BI and with data warehouse, it starts small. Start by getting the right information first in a way that it's easily consumable. So a small data set as an example, and work on that within Python or in Power BI if you want to have like a flat text file. And then when it goes to that data warehouse world where multiple people are using it and making decisions on it to get that productionized, then you can talk about how do we make this work at an enterprise-wide level. But yeah, I think that, and that's the beauty of this Python R, is that you can start small and you can become quite powerful very quickly without IT and bureaucracy getting involved. Signups, yes, or just an ETL database, that's also fine. Any, I say data warehouse, it could be any data source, like wherever your data is being structured. So that's just a generalized term for data warehouse, but yes. All right. So none of the questions come through. So as I said, the example files, they'll help you on your way. As a little bonus for putting up with my voice for the last 50 or so minutes, Altus are offering 10% off training. So we do have Power BI courses. We do have data sciencey courses coming up, or release something to that effect. And that talks a lot about R and some of the more advanced features of R, obviously the machine learning and AI space. So 10% off with that. So have a chat with your an account manager with Altus, or if you have access to the regional manager Altus, have a chat with them when you want to book that training and to have that. I know we do a lot of dashboard and a day courses, which Microsoft run. They're quite successful. You get a bit out of that if you're not a Power BI expert. And also, yeah, the data science course, if you're wanting to expand your knowledge in a growing world, in a growing trend, you can certainly tag onto one of those training sessions as well. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then you can have a bit of an early lunch, which is good. The links, yeah, so that's a good one. Send the link to the data science course. I think they're on our training page, but we'll make sure that they're on that that thank you email, or we'll find a way to send that out to you to get you interested in that. Okay, well, I think that's all. Thank you for your attendance. I hope you've got something out of it. Yeah, have a good day.